Hello friends, welcome back to the Strong Stoic Podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Tumblin. Now, logos is a very abstract and difficult idea to understand. At least it is for me. Is in the present tense, not in the past tense. It's present in many ancient philosophies, as well as the religion of Christianity and Judaism and all the Abrahamic religions, including Islam. One of the confusing aspects is the fact that the definition changes to some degree depending on which philosophy you're talking about. Despite its complexity, however, or maybe even perhaps because of its complexity, I think that an understanding of what logos is crucial for the practicing of Stoicism, as it is the spirit of the entire philosophy. So I think we're missing something when we don't understand on some deep level what logos is and why we should trust in it. This podcast is listener supported. If you would like to support this podcast and you like the Strong Stoic Podcast, consider joining me on Patreon, where you can become one of my patrons there. You get early access to the podcast episodes, and you also get access to an exclusive series that I do called Steps to Success with some of my guests, rather. I've done this with several people up to this point, and I want to keep going. I've done Shane Trotter as an example, and I also have one coming out. Actually, this one should be out now, which is Dr. Brian Russell, the most recent person that I've done a Steps to Success episode with, which is just a short episode exclusive to my Patreon supporters that talks about their success in life and what they think success is and how it leads to it. You can also check out my articles on Medium and the Stoic Gym magazine. My newsletter finally is on Substack, and you can also get Steps to Success on Substack if you become a supporter on there. Okay, now on to the history of logos. The word logos dates back to classical Greece. It translates to something like word, thought, principle, speech, dialogue. I'll get into this more later, but I think that this translation is perhaps the best way and most simplest way of understanding the concept of logos. Broadly speaking, there's two main ideas associated with logos. There's one that is very Stoic, which is dealing with human rationality and reason, which seeks a harmonic existence and an understanding of the universe, or cosmos, you could say. So, in essence, one is human rationality. That's an idea that is logos, which feeds into reason and word and thought and speech and principles. And then the second one is also very Stoic-like. So one of the things you're going to learn in this episode is that logos is extremely Stoic. It's the foundation of the philosophy and of other philosophies as well. But the Stoics, so they weren't directly the first people to think about this concept. They were certainly a group that developed it quite a bit. The other one that I mentioned, so the first one is dealing with human rationality and reason, but the other one is dealing with a universal intelligence. Now, we could perhaps call that God, right? A universal intelligence, but at the very least, maybe if you don't like the God speak, you could say it represents the divine, is the connection with something that is greater than humanity. In the Christian world, that would be the Abrahamic God. In Stoicism, it would be the organism that is the cosmopolitus. More on that later. Heraclitus was the first to speak about this idea, the second idea of logos, the divine idea, I shouldn't say the fact, but certainly the idea that the cosmos is an organism and we are just a cell in that organism. But for those who don't know, Heraclitus, he was pre-Socratic, meaning he was before the age of Socrates. I've always found that term kind of interesting, to say the least, pre-Socratic. I mean, basically what that means is Socrates was such an influential philosopher that the term pre-Socratic was deemed necessary by philosophers. That's quite the compliment there, Soc. Anyways, the point is that Heraclitus was around before Socrates and also before the Stoics. It's about 500 BC or so. Hence, he wasn't by definition a Stoic, because obviously Stoicism was not a thing before him. Zeno wouldn't find Stoicism until a couple of hundred years later, but Heraclitus was incredibly influential to Stoic philosophy, and as I always say, we really have no idea just how old some of these philosophical ideas are, so it's an odd thing to call them Christian or Stoic or Buddhist or anything else really, because who really knows who came up with the first idea of these things? What makes Heraclitus an interesting figure to me is that, None of his work survived. Rather, we have over 100 fragments of his work because he was quoted so many times by later philosophers whose work did survive. But it's all fragments. It's all Heraclitus said this in other philosophers' writing, and we don't actually have anything that survived that was written by Heraclitus. Now I'm going down a bit of a rabbit hole because, well, Heraclitus he's a pretty cool figure. He's an interesting guy, and, well, let's be honest, he has a really cool name. But after Heraclitus came the Socrates, of course, and then the Stoics. And the Stoics really developed this idea of logos to what is understood to be today, with the exception of Christianity, which added salvation to the mix. But predominantly the idea of logos was really developed by the Stoics. And the Christians really take that idea of logos pretty much at face value, though they add a little bit about salvation, but predominantly they take what the Stoics said to be logos. Now, with the history at least somewhat defined in terms of logos, it started with Heraclitus, made its way through Socrates, and then the Stoics, which really developed it, and then the Christians took the logos and kind of added a little bit of salvation idea to it, but predominantly it was the Stoics. Now that we have that somewhat understood, and I'm going to have to apologize in advance to regular listeners of the Strong Stoic for restating a lot of this, but I think refreshing on some of these concepts is critical in understanding the topic at hand. But just remember that the core Stoic doctrine is live according to nature, and everybody knows that, though I think it's harder to really understand what that means in all levels of analysis. But what this means in practice is it's a state of harmony between who you are, your relationship to everyone else around you, and Mother Nature herself, or objective reality. And as I mentioned earlier, there's this idea of logos in terms of this universal intelligence. Well, that's really the cosmopolitan that the Stoics talk so much about, and it's the idea that Heraclitus really brought to fruition. But it's the simple idea, or the not so simple idea, that we are all part of a greater whole. We are just one little piece of the pie, and that there is a greater whole, and that greater whole is an organism. Now, this might sound crazy to consider the cosmos as an organism, but understand that human beings are just a collection of individually alive cells, which are parts of the greater whole, that being you as an individual. So perhaps we are just another cell in a much larger entity, that being the cosmos. Who knows? I mean, it's a weird thing to wrap your head around, to think, well, maybe the cosmos is alive and it has consciousness. But then you think, well, human beings each individually have consciousness, and so if we define the cosmos as the collection of all human beings and everything, inanimate objects and everything that exists in the world, well, wouldn't it be the case that the cosmos is actually a collection of consciousness? And so maybe it actually does have consciousness. If you think about it in that way, it's not some kind of supernatural thing. It's actually a very true statement. I mean, if human beings have consciousness, and we consider the cosmos to be a collection of human beings and other things, then wouldn't it follow that, well, of course, the cosmos is an organism as well with consciousness? That's the whole idea of the cosmopolitan. But if you consider those three environments that I mentioned earlier, the live according to nature, which is harmony between who you are, your relationship to others, and alignment with objective reality, there's an essential ingredient there that we have to know there. How do we achieve that? Well, it's through seeking truth. Now, this is where things get a little complicated, because truth is not a cardinal virtue, though Jordan Peterson has popularized the idea that truth is very important to flourish, and it is, but only in a certain context. And this is one of my criticisms to Jordan Peterson, is he talks about truth a lot, but he understands that there's a very specific definition of what truth is, but he doesn't really clarify that a lot. Truth is no simple thing. Objective truth is easy to understand, that, well, let's say a rock is gray, or a rock is black, or the earth is round, etc. These are scientific facts, is what we would call it today. But what about truths about yourself? What about truths that help you live a fulfilling life, which I have termed in the past philosophical truths? Which I would say a philosophical truth is something that you act on, or a perspective that you gain that might not be literally true, but if you adopt it and accept it, it seems to make your life better. And perhaps it doesn't even matter if it's literally true, such as the idea that we all share in the divine. I mean, that might not be true. it might be true. Who the hell knows? But what I do know is that if you agree and accept and acknowledge that there's a connection between all human beings, you're much more likely to have compassion for other human beings, specifically ones that need the compassion the most, which are those that are evil. So that's a philosophical truth, at least how I would define it. Here's another example, though. It's an objective truth that you will die. That's a fact. It has no value to it. You will die. Us human beings, we assign the value. And if you're a philosopher, if you're a Stoic, you would never lie and tell yourself that you will never die, but you will adjust your perspective to one that accepts death as it is and use that perspective to flourish. Now the point is that live according to nature, it could equally mean live according to truth, because nature is truth, but it's not as simple as objective truth. It's not just scientific truth. It's philosophical truth. It's connections between each other. It's philosophical ideas, which require some level of faith, which is an interesting thing to tie in with truth, isn't it? But we have to be really careful how we understand that term, is my point. Truth, capital T, truth. In any case, the pursuit of a flourishing life is really the pursuit of truth. And how do we pursue truth? Well, through logos, to get back to the topic at hand here. Remember, logos is translated as word, thought, principle, speech, dialogue, something like that, reason, rationality. Logos is the mechanism by which we flourish. It's how we come to learn whatever the hell the truth actually is. It's how we pursue truth, and hence it's how we live according to nature. Now, there's the common Christian phrase, the Word of God, capital W, Word of God, referring typically to the Bible. The Bible is how God speaks to humans, right? At least that's what the Christians believe. But note that it is the Word of God, the Logos of God. And so Logos is how we live a fulfilling life by connecting us with God, either the Stoic God, which is the pantheistic God, the natural God, or the Christian God. It's the same idea. It's just you have to think about God in a slightly different perspective in terms of what it actually is. But however you wish to define God, Logos is how we live a fulfilling life by connecting us with God. Now, if you are scared by that word God, and I'm sure many of you are, that's fine. Consider it like this. There's a mode of human existence where you are completely fulfilled in life. Just imagine that. Some future scenario where you're just fulfilled in life. You're loving your life. You have gratitude. You're happy. Whatever, however you want to define it. The way of life that allows that fulfillment to come into fruition is very individualized to you. Meaning, one way of life might not work for you, while another way of life may, and your way of life that allows you to flourish might not work perfectly for somebody else. We're all individuals at the end of the day. That's live according to personal nature, feeling good in your own skin. But there's a tremendous amount of overlap between all humans as well. So obviously we all have individual preferences on how we wish to live, but then there's all these common things such as, generally speaking, we all like community. Generally speaking, like we're social beings. I mean, it's a fact that if you leave someone in solitude too long, they actually do become a little crazy. And that's why even in prisons, solitude is like the worst punishment. You put someone alone as opposed to out into the yard with a bunch of other criminals. That being alone is worse than that. That's something that's very interesting and worth considering. The idea is that if we understand what that mode of existence entails, whatever mode of being that allows you to be fulfilled, if we can understand what that is, then we can achieve that fulfilled state. And that mode of existence, again, whatever that is one of being aligned with, quote, quote, God. So we can think about this entirely rationally. We don't have to bring in anything that makes you uncomfortable, dear listener. Now, the pursuit of truth is done through logos, as I mentioned, which is, thought, word, principle, speech, dialogue, again. In other words, through the use of the rational mind that the cosmos gifted us human beings. But there's something in there that isn't directly obvious. Logos requires each other. It requires community, which kind of harps on the point I made earlier about how we all need community. Speech. Speech is to others. Sure, you can talk to yourself, but the whole point of speech is so that someone else can listen. Because why would you speak if it's just you. You can just think, right? The idea can be put rather simply. If we wish to understand the truth, so that we can live according to truth, so that we can live according to nature, in other words, we are best off having dialogue with each other. We should talk. We should discuss things. We all have a piece of the divine that allows us to see some truth, that allows us to engage in the process of bringing good into being, of bringing virtue into being. But we only have a piece of the divine. We don't have the entire divine. So the idea is, if we engage in dialogue, you can see my divinity, I can see yours, you can see someone else's, and together we all bring a little piece of the pie. And if we do that, maybe we can actually have a full pie. We can make our pie more complete at the very least. So we do that through logos, through dialogue, through word, through speech, principle, etc. So what does it mean to trust in logos? It means that despite us having disagreements, despite us arguing, despite us exchanging some perhaps harsh words from time to time, despite our internal feelings on the truth that we should all wholeheartedly agree to engage in discussion with each other, despite all the flaws in the system, the frustration, the arguments, the disagreements, we should still talk to each other. The left should speak with the right should speak with the left, the Christians and the Muslims should speak, the Stoics and the Christians should speak. Hell, we can have a table talk. We should do it. The traditional Stoics should speak with the modern Stoics. It's the same idea. This is why it's so important as a society to protect freedom of speech, by the way, because without freedom of speech, what do you lose? Well, you lose logos. And if you lose logos, you lose the ability to flourish, at least according to the Stoics. And I would say that I share in that belief, as dogmatic as it may seem. Some discussions are very hard to have, but remember what the alternative is. The alternative to dialogue, to logos, is one that many have taken in the past and continue to take today. It's one that results not in fulfillment for all, but quite the opposite. The alternative to dialogue is war. And no discussion is worse than war. So let's all trust in logos and keep up the dialogue. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you're new here, consider leaving a rating and review wherever you're listening to this. Much, much appreciated. Episodes every Tuesday at the moment. I may ramp back up and do every Tuesday and Thursday in a few weeks or so. Right now, it's a weekly podcast. But you have over 260, or I guess 260 exactly, episodes to catch up on, so you feel free to do that. You can find me anywhere, by the way, Twitter, Instagram, wherever you're listening as well. And you can subscribe wherever you're listening as well. And that's all for today. I'm not going to bug anymore. Thanks again. Cheers until